Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 28th Labelle Lectureship in Health Services Research. I am Sofia Gracia, a third-year PhD student in the Health Policy program here at McMaster University, and I will be your MC today. So first and foremost, I would like to begin the event by taking the time to recognize that we are currently on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. So welcome again to the 28th Labelle Lecture. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces today as well as new faces. So we have people here from various departments across the university, from MPH, HRM, Health Policy, Economics, Indigenous Studies. And this year, we've also doing the Labelle Lecture in partnership with the New Frontiers in Health Policy Conference, which took place earlier today. So we have people coming in from different universities as well. So when coming in, you must have all received a program which shows the outline for today. We will begin with Mr. Jean-Eric Tarid, who will give words of welcome. We will then move to Dr. Jennifer Walker, who is our Labelle lecturer for this year. We will then move to the discussant, and finally we will end with a reception. So at this time, I'd like to invite Jean-Eric to the stage. Jean-Eric is a professor in the Department of HEI, Health Research, Methods, Evidence, and Impact, and he's the director of CHEPA, the Center for Health Economics and Policy. So welcome.
Thank you very much. So I would like to say a few words on behalf of CHEPA. So Roberta Labelle was one of the CHEPA's founding members. Her death in 1991 was unexpected and occurred when broad recognition for research in health economics was just starting to emerge. In memory of Roberta, CHEPA and the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact collaborated on establishing the annual Labelle Lectureship series. The Labelle Lectureship is awarded every year to a young investigator of promise engaged in multidisciplinary health services research with challenging existing methods or accepting ideas in the field. Past lecturers include the likes of Andrew Jones, Peter Singer, Colin Flood, Mark Sculfer, Jennifer Pratt-Ruger, Steve Morgan, Michael Lowe, and David Stuckler. So we are particularly grateful for the donation received since the first Labelle lecture from more than 20 donors who have generously provided more than $30,000 to the lectureship. Thank you. I will pass it now to Dr. Jerry Early. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Jean-Eric. I would now like to welcome Jerry Hurley to the front, who will introduce our lecturer, Labelle lecturer for today. Jerry is a Dean of Social Sciences, and he's a professor in the Department of Economics.
Thanks, Sophia. So it's my pleasure today to introduce this year's Labelle lecture. And as you know, it's Jennifer Walker. And Jennifer Walker is a health services researcher and epidemiologist. She is a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and she holds a PhD in community health sciences from the University of Calgary. Her work focuses on Indigenous use of Indigenous health and health services data across the life course, with a focus on older adults. She collaborates closely with Indigenous organizations and communities to address the health information needs of these communities. Jennifer holds a Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Health at Laurentian University in the School of Rural and Northern Health. She is a core scientist and Indigenous lead at ISIS. And she also holds appointments at the Mamuzing Indigenous Research Institute, the Centre for Rural and Northern Health Research in the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. So welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm setting my phone to tell me how much time, because I get used to lecturing for 3 hours, and I don't think you want to sit here that long. So thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting me here to do this. I also want to say that, I'm beyond all the things you said. I also am a mom of 2 kids and a granddaughter to 4 grandparents, a daughter to my dad back there, and a sister to my sister who's also here. I'm really excited to be here because I feel close to home here. Having grown up, I grew up in the sort of around this area and Flamborough and the areas close to here. I now live in Sudbury, which is Anishinaabe territory, and work at Laurentian University. So it's also an adventure and experience to be there, but it's nice to be here as well. It's very timely, I think, to be talking about Indigenous data and research. It's really an important conversation as we look forward to the kinds of health system reforms that are happening in our province, as we look forward to, as we sort of continue to address calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as we look to the calls for justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. As we do all of those things, thinking about where Indigenous data sit in that, how those conversations about Indigenous data sit in those broader conversations about health, about healthcare, and about sovereignty it's really important. So I'm really pleased to be able to be here and to be sharing with you. So I want to ground ourselves. So actually, Sophia mentioned one of like a wampum. That was the dishes one spoon. I wanted to also ground our conversation today in the Two-Row Treaty. So nod your head if you're familiar with this, if you've seen it before. So in Sudbury, most people are not as familiar, so I'm really happy to hear that, but that's because we're we're in Haudenosaunee territory here. So this idea here that as we travel, we'll travel together in friendship, and this was an agreement. These were treaties. These were agreements about how we would live together as Indigenous people and as settlers in this land. And this particular treaty talks about the 2 separate paths. We talks about the sovereignty, essentially, where we have a path that is Indigenous governance structures, Indigenous family structures, Indigenous language, and thinking about that as being a separate but parallel system to the settler systems of government, language, family structure, knowledges. And this agreement is about traveling alongside one another and not interfering. This really important concept of non-interference is one of the grounding principles that I want us to just think about as we talk about Indigenous data, Indigenous policy development that affect, Indigenous policy development that happens within Indigenous governance structures, as well as policy development that affects Indigenous people. So together we will travel in friendship and in peace forever, as long as the grass is green, as long as the water runs downhill, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and as long as our Mother Earth will last. So still valid, right? Agreement generally? Okay. So then what happened? So if we think about that as policy, if we think about that as an agreement, as a treaty, here's what followed. Here's the kinds of conversations that followed those initial conversations and agreements. And so now you're hearing history from an epidemiologist. So caution up front that this is history from an epidemiologist's perspective. But some of the things that really need to ground us as we think about Indigenous data and health policy and health reform, we have to be thinking about these colonial policies and legislation that have impacted the way the relationship actually turned out. So one of the most fundamental grounding principles of that is actually the doctrine of discovery. So just generally, is there familiarity with the doctrine of discovery? Some, but less. Okay, good. So I have something to share. So really, this gave Christian explorers the rights and, in a sense, the responsibility to claim lands that they discovered. And to claim them for their Christian monarchs, essentially. And if land was not inhabited by Christians, it was available to be discovered. So these kinds, sometimes it's sort of hard to figure out, where did this all come from? Why did it start this way? And this is some of the little things that help us understand why the relationships began the way they did, and what paths we've traveled together, and where that sort of came from. This was really, really part of that foundation. Another part of that foundation really began when settlers started to come here. And there was in 1763 royal proclamation that established that First Nations peoples were legitimate occupants of the land. So it wasn't the case where it was that there was no recognition that First Nations peoples were here and that there were sovereign nations here. This proclamation talked about the need to establish agreements to legitimize the use of the land because it recognized that nations were here. So as things evolved, though, there began to be the process of treaty making, some of the more formal treaties, the treaty that affects the lands that where I live and work now, the Robinson-Huron treaties in 1850s. And then policies began to be established that were imposed. Policies began to be established that formed a foundation for the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, although it's listed here as 1876, is still quite present. We still have an act called the Indian Act. And that this series of acts that formed a foundation for the Indian Act assigned, these are some of the key things that happened. They assigned Indians as a federal responsibility. They gave wide-reaching power to the federal government and Indian affairs in terms of the actual affairs of people's lives. And some of the things that came out of this, the Indian Act itself, so it defined what an Indian meant, and really gave that far-reaching power. Some of the examples that happened in that far-reaching power included things like forced attendance in school, outlawing dances, ceremonies, and festivals, allowed for the removal of First Nations people from reserves that were close to towns. So it was actually, there were a lot of things that were amended to make it more and more easy to be taking up the land, and to be asserting the sort of colonizing approaches and assimilatory approaches. So things like residential schools, further occupation of land, and also, even to the point of making sure that people weren't even allowed to solicit funds for legal activity, to be able to take action against some of these things, or against claims related to land. You couldn't even raise money or be paying a lawyer, kind of thing. So if we think about this legislation, this Indian Act, it's very clear to us now that what the purpose was, and it was assimilation. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So there's really the reasons for this, the reasons why stem back to things like the doctrine of discovery, but also stem to economic incentives to make sure that people are becoming part of the economic activity of this newly settled land, things like that from a colonizing perspective. So one of those vehicles of assimilation was residential schools. And the intergenerational effects of those residential schools impact today, where we are today. So this is a map that shows where residential schools was. It doesn't even include day schools, which we're now talking more about in the sort of general Canadian landscape. So you can see how widespread residential schools were. We've learned a lot more about this. So even 5 years ago, when I'd be talking to students about residential schools, they might have been hearing about them for the first time. But now I think there's a general heightened awareness and general collective consciousness about residential schools and the impacts that those have had, thanks to the, heart work that was done in the Truth and Reconciliation process and the sharing that people did in that process about their experiences. Those experiences were not simply individuals' experiences of trauma and abuse. They certainly were individual experiences of trauma and abuse, but it was the collective impact of a disruption of the things that were in our row, the things that were in that row of language, of land, of culture, of governance systems, of family structures, of knowledge. That disruption of that is part of a collective trauma that continues to be seen. So this idea that it visited us every day, this is a quote from a child of former students, it visited us every day of our childhood through the replaying over and over of our parents' childhood trauma and grief, which they never had the opportunity to resolve in their lifetimes. So I think that when we think about the current landscape, we can't think about it without thinking about these roots and where collective trauma has come from, where health disparities and inequities, where any of those things that we're talking about in terms of difference, in terms of health status and difference come from. But it's mostly important so that we can move to the next phases, so that we understand that truth and we can move towards next phases of healing and reconciliation. So but really the purpose of those residential schools was to educate the children properly. In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. And this sort of speaks to that economic need to have people part of this economic system, and that's what civilizing was. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. This is Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs at the time. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question. So through the Indian Act, through the medicine chest clause, which is the root of some of the federal jurisdiction for health that happened in one particular treaty, Treaty 6. We have this multi-jurisdictional responsibility for health. So federal jurisdiction for Indigenous health and federal jurisdiction for Indigenous people. But when it comes to how the healthcare system is experienced and how the healthcare system works for Indigenous people, it is quite complex, actually. We have some things that are federal jurisdiction, some things that are First Nation community jurisdiction, some things that are provincial jurisdiction. And so there is a patchwork of responsibility that sometimes, that is often quite challenging to piece together. And I think that we have also a spectrum of funding models for First Nation communities to be able to respond to the health needs of populations, and so the models vary in their degree of self-determination that a First Nation can have over over how funding is used and allocated in their communities. So I wanted to ground us a little bit. So we talked about that importance of sovereignty and self-determination. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is over 10 years old, but was only recently sort of accepted in Canada as something that Canada would commit to, has the whole purpose of this document is to essentially outline how Indigenous people's rights, what does that mean, Indigenous rights, and how across the world can we ensure that the rights that Indigenous peoples have in their lands can be actually achieved and accomplished. And so I kind of selected out a few of the articles out of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that speak to some of the things that we're talking about. So this right to self-determination is fundamental, this right. The right to autonomy and self-government is fundamental. But let's also not forget that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. And this is really important because in our context in Canada, we have actually a wide diversity in Indigenous nations in Canada that are in the land of Canada. And so this doesn't mean that we have sort of one Indigenous government that complements a federal government, for example. The fact that this is here means that there has to be, that diversity has to be reflected as we look at cultural institutions, political institutions in Indigenous communities. And I think that this next one, the Article 15, also talks about the diversity of cultures, traditions, and histories. So we have, in Canada, we have three constitutionally recognized groups of Indigenous peoples. We have First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'm telling you stuff you know. I know, I'm just reviewing. So, but among First Nations, so I mentioned, we've been talking about even within Ontario, we have, so I live in Anishinaabe territory. My family comes from a Haudenosaunee community. There are Cree communities in the north. So this diversity of nations actually is reflected in a diversity of knowledges, actually, and in approaches to thinking about governance, to thinking about how we build our institutions. In parallel, so this is in parallel to how our Indigenous knowledges would build institutions, we have imposed institutions. We have institutions that are imposed by the Indian Act that dictate how, as First Nations, we interact with one another and interact with the federal government. So, for example, to make that a bit more concrete, in some communities we'll have an elected chief and council at the same time as a traditional council that is that would be more of an Indigenous governance model. So when a lot of the research that I do and the work that I do in communities has to reflect this diversity. It has to reflect the fact that a Métis, in Ontario, a Métis approach to doing research and working with data would be different from an Anishinaabe way of approach to looking at and working with data. The sort of structures and even research questions that we come up with would be different according to the nation that is needing the data for their governance. So a few of these other articles, you know, obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, determining and developing priorities and strategies, and administering programs, these things are all really practical ways of actually implementing and seeing in action the rights of Indigenous people. And I think there's some that we're struggling with in Canada. I think we're not, you know, we're not as far along this spectrum as we might hope to be. So I think that it's something we should keep grounding ourselves in as we look forward. When we're getting a little closer to data now, so for the past, since the 1990s, First Nations have been, in Canada, have been asserting sovereignty over their data. They've been saying, you know, to the federal government, to researchers, stop telling our stories without us. Stop using our data, stop collecting our data in ways that serve your needs but not ours. So in the 1990s, amazing leaders established this set of principles called OCAP. And OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, and refers to the rights of First Nation communities to own, protect, and control how their information is used for research and other purposes. So actually you can, this is, you see the registered trademark there. It's actually the First Nations Information Governance Center has trademarked this phrase, OCAP, this acronym, and you can go and actually do, it takes about 6, maybe 8-hour online course to learn about OCAP and learn about that history of research and use of data that has been harmful in First Nation communities, and the reasons for which OCAP is important, and then how to make sure that the work that you're doing in research, policy development, health economics, any of the work that you're doing, how to ensure that First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession is part of your process. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the little photo in the middle there. So when I'm working in Anishinaabe territory, there's a set of teachings. They're commonly called the 7 grandfather teachings. And often when communities want to work with their data, first they want to say, OCAP. They want to say, okay, we own, control, access, and possess our data. We need to do it ourselves. No one else is going to tell our stories for us. But then once you set that boundary, you have to figure out how to work with that data and work within it. So as First Nations people, and in this case as Anishinaabe communities, they have to decide, how do we work with the data in ways that express wisdom, in ways that will build truth, in ways that we show each other love, bravery, respect, humility, honesty. These things, so we have to use that. Once we've set the parameters and said, we're going to do it the way we need to do it, then we have to decide the principles in which we're actually going to work together and use the data. And so I say that because there's a wide diversity of actual Indigenous knowledges and teachings. This is one example. When we're, so in some of the work that I'm doing with Inuit, they have a different set of knowledge principles that upon which we've built our agreements and relationships and principles for using data. And so these will be very specific, I think, you know, they'll be very specific to nations who want to work with their data, and the conversations up front to set parameters, to set principles of working together is really important. In the work that I do with actual data, so I, you know, at the beginning it was mentioned that I'm the Indigenous lead at ICES, and I think you said ISIS though. We don't say ISIS anymore. You're old. It took a good year to get it trained out of me. Yeah. So at ICES, which is where we hold the large provincial data sets that are generated through use of the healthcare system. So for example, if you go to a hospital or a doctor, a record of that interaction is kept in large data sets and can be linked together using your health card. What we also have done is found ways to be able to unlock that data so that First Nations can answer questions about their health with the data. The Métis Nation of Ontario can answer questions about their health with the data. And so some of these calls to action directly talk about the kinds of things that we're trying to do with those data. So one of the calls to action says that we need to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is the direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools. So we talked about that. Another one is to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes. We'll talk about that in a second. Then also to recognize, respect, and address the distinct health needs of Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal peoples. And I think we've touched on that diversity and the distinct nature of the work with each of those. So how this actually plays out sometimes can be complex. So in our research and in our work, our collaborative work with communities, we have to, this call to action 18, to acknowledge it's not an academic exercise. The same people who went to residential school are the people advising on the research projects I do. It's not abstract, it's not hundreds of years ago. The same people, so in some of the research that I'm working on, where we're actually developing new culturally informed ways of doing cognitive assessments in communities, those same people who will be assessed either in the research or in practice are the same people who went to residential schools. So there's that aspect of it, that we need to be aware of that and trauma informed in the way we approach cognitive assessment and care, but also in the way we approach research. So one example of this is that one of the earliest times when I met with a group of older people on Manitoulin Island, I was talking about the data at ICES and talking about the possibilities of what we might be able to do with that data at ICES. What I didn't know was that one of the people who was in that room had just that morning had a really negative interaction with someone from the, who was she was trying to fish, and someone was shutting her down from fishing in her traditional territory. So this negative interaction with someone from the provincial government. And so that colored and informed the interaction that she and I had about data that's generated in the provincial healthcare system. And so approaching that conversation even, approaching not just the actual research, like when you're assessing someone or collecting data, but approaching the conversation about research and data also has to be informed by this, and acknowledging that this intergenerational effects of these colonial policies and the ongoing trauma that's caused by these policies will impact how we work together. I want to pause for a second on the call to action 19, which is about establishing measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes. Now, as an epidemiologist, this is like what I'm about, right? This is what I'm really interested in, is looking at those gaps in health outcomes. But I want to pause here for a second, because when we think about those gaps, my first question is, what gap are we talking about? So you might imagine that the gap we're talking about is, on average, how are First Nations people doing compared to non-First Nations people? And what is that gap? That's one way of looking at a gap. But I think that most of the work I've done with elders has told me that what we need to be thinking about is our conception of holistic health. And where are we right now? And that is the gap we need to be thinking about closing. So we have to come at it, even the definition of health, from an Indigenous perspective and from Indigenous knowledges, to be able to understand what gap we even need to close. So our current status compared to the ideal status of holistic health, which is different than saying, is our diabetes rate higher or lower than the general population? That's also possibly important. That gap is also important to close. But what might be more important to close is this idea of wellness. You know, as a person ages, the balance and wellness and where people are currently at in their ability to age well. So this in some ways summarizes, but also is a really important reminder that the act of knowing is a collective cultural and political imperative for Indigenous peoples. Information, data, and research about our peoples, collected about us, with us, or by us, belongs to us and must be cared for by us. So it's really a strong statement about the sacredness of data and who needs to take care of it. The way that data is often used is this sort of way of just describing these gaps, just describing ongoing disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. This is from a colleague in Australia, Maggie Walter, and she's good at these little easy ways of remembering things, like 5 Ds. But then I remember 4 and I forget the 5th. But so this is often, like, as someone, you know, who, you know, when we learn about logistic regression in our epidemiology courses, we often model a negative outcome, right? We're often thinking about that disparity and the difference. And one way that this has become really clear to me is working at ICES, working with scientists at ICES who really, from the bottom of their hearts, think that by telling the story of where there's problems, that something will naturally happen to fix them. So we just have to show the difference. If we just show that, you know, in this part of northwestern Ontario that always looks worse than the rest of northwestern or the rest of Ontario, then something will happen to make it better. But what actually happens is that the people in that area of northwestern Ontario, the stories told about them are always negative. It'd be like, you know, hearing that same, you know, when I'm having a bad week and every student I see tells me I look tired, like that does not feel good, and then you just end up feeling worse and worse. And this is the reality, right? We also have to be thinking about strengths. We have to be modeling our strengths. We have to be, if we change our view and think about our strengths, then it helps us to find, okay, I used this in the podcast earlier, but I'm going to say it again. I keep forgetting who I'd said what to. But, you know, instead of shining a light on problems, it's like using it as a flashlight to find the way forward, to find that next step towards healing and closing those gaps between where we are and where our ideal holistic health would be. So using data in negative ways continues to classify Indigenous people as problematic. Data are used to rationalize dispossession, marginalization, and to perpetuate narratives of dependency. So when you hear over and over again that a community has problems, then the general consensus is, well, they can't take care of themselves. We're going to have to do something. And so these narratives of dependency instead of strength, these narratives of dispossession instead of resilience are actually problematic. So we have to disrupt our thinking about our methodology, our methods for doing, even the way we model, even the outcomes we choose. And if we do that without community, then we're just going to continue the problems. So we have a network of people who are thinking about this globally. There's this amazing resource called Indigenous Data Sovereignty Toward an Agenda. We have some stuff that we've done collaboratively with others to talk about Indigenous health data and finding a path to healing. So resources that I definitely highly recommend. Well, it's weird to recommend your own paper, but definitely. But this group has crystallized a little bit into a global Indigenous Data Alliance. And this is, in several places, there's really strong Indigenous data sovereignty networks. That globe looks a little funny, but it's meant to be stretched out. It must have been something happened with my slides. But this thinking is happening internationally. And this thinking about what does it mean to have Indigenous data sovereignty is happening. And we have to be part of that conversation globally, but we have to figure out not just what it means in Canada, but what it means nation by nation, community by community. So the two conditions for data sovereignty, wow, there's something really fun going on out there. But it's really fun in here too, so there's two conditions for data sovereignty. One is decolonizing data. And some of the things we need to do to decolonize data are to look at the right outcomes, to not only rely on narratives of disparity. And then we also need to have governance we need to have Indigenous data governance. So this little, this is courtesy of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, but this cycle here of having governance of data. So the data at ICES have to be governed by First Nations when they're telling First Nations stories. But then we use the data for governance. That's the part where as First Nations, we really need to get in there. We really need to be understanding data and using it for governance. So we're talking about not just using data for advocacy, talking about using it to guide our next step, where we shine that light. It's like a big thing to compete with out there. So, are they? Yeah. So, having information gaps, if we want to achieve this, if we want to achieve nation rebuilding through Indigenous data sovereignty, then we have to acknowledge that there are information gaps that lead to policy gaps. So, there has been a long-standing lack of information for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples because we don't have good identifiers in data, because we don't have Indigenous governance over the way data are collected. We aren't using our Indigenous knowledges in large data collections to be able to dictate what the important things are to collect, to measure. What things do we want to track? What outcomes do we want to measure? So this work of continuing to unlock administrative data for use has been really one of my preoccupations. And this is happening not just in Ontario, it is happening really actively in Ontario, but at least in 6 places across Ontario, regions being provinces, they're accessing provincial data through linkage. So you may have seen a fairly recent report out of Manitoba, where the Manitoba First Nations accessed similar data that would be held at ICES, so their provincial health services data, to answer questions about First Nations health in Manitoba. So this is happening, and the thing is, it requires a lot of trust building, obviously, partnership, relationship, and agreements, and those things are really important. So you can't do this kind of work without formal agreements, because you can work on your relationship, but as soon as that relationship shifts or the person leaves or something like that, and there aren't agreements to back it up, then it won't be sustained. But you can't do it with just agreements, because without the relationship, there's no spirit in those agreements, and they won't work. So the importance of true partnership and agreements is very much part of this. So over many years in Ontario, before I became involved at all, there was a lot of conversation and challenging conversations about the data that sit at ICES. And scientists are very creative, very, very sneaky, just kidding. But, you know, what was happening was actually, you know, that some scientists were like, well, we really know this is going to be an important question for First Nations, so we're going to use postal codes to try and figure out where the First Nation communities are, and then we'll report it by First Nation postal code, not First Nation postal code, without talking to any First Nations about that. So that happened a couple of times before the Chiefs of Ontario talked to the CEO of ICES at the time and said, please stop telling our stories without us. Please stop reporting on things that you don't understand. You don't understand the hurt that it's doing to us. Let's work together. And so I've used this image of a spider web because it sort of, to me, conveys the complexity of relationships. You know, it's not a rope. It's not just, you know, ICES First Nations and that's it. It's really quite complex, the relationships. It's also, you know, strong, you know, when it stays together, but as soon as something doesn't work, then the whole thing is affected. So I think that we have to think carefully and be soft in our relationships. They're not like hard-nosed negotiations. We're trying to build relationships to do something together. So we started, there was a resolution from the Chiefs of Ontario saying, you can see right there, you probably can't read it, but it says our inherent right of self-government includes the exercise of jurisdiction over First Nations information as expressed through First Nations principles of OCAP. So that's the starting point, okay? We have self-government, we need OCAP. And so they're basically saying we assert our jurisdiction over First Nations data that ICES holds. They invoke the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All these things come into this resolution that was made by the elected chiefs. There was another more specific about ICES. You can see right there in the first whereas that ICES was called out as a holder of data where this jurisdiction applied. And then we ended with a First Nations data governance agreement between the Chiefs of Ontario and ICES. So in that data governance agreement, we put in processes that support OCAP to ensure that no ICES data are used to tell First Nations stories without First Nations. So you can't access First Nations data at ICES without permission and without appropriate engagement. So we have done several projects. One of them is going to be released very soon, and it's a project on diabetes, and it's a whole massive atlas. That's an ICES term, but it's basically a big report on diabetes and you know, relationships with cardiovascular disease and all sorts of other outcomes. But this was something I wrote with Carmen Jones, who's the health director at the Chiefs of Ontario, talking about our relationship and how it was expressed through this project, so that we had not just the permissions. It's not just enough to get the permissions, although we did have the permissions, but also the importance of having involvement of elders, having involvement of people who live with diabetes in communities, involvement of family members of people who have complications of diabetes, all sorts of layers to our relationships that, that made this project what it was. We've also done work with this data now. It's opened up a ton of possibilities. These are some of the other sort of Ontario level projects that have happened around cancer. This one's published, so you can go on Cancer Care Ontario's websites there. There was a report to the First Nations Long-Term Care Tripartite Working Group on First Nations Long-Term Care, using some of the data that we looked at together about multimorbidity and the needs for long-term care in First Nation communities. And we also have a final report now on opioid, it's actually prescription opioid use among First Nations people in Ontario. That was also, by resolution from the Chiefs, asked us to do that. What it also opens up is other projects that don't happen at a whole provincial level. Sometimes we get requests from individual communities to answer questions that they might have. But this one in particular, it was a group that started out as the First Nations Center for Excellence in Epidemiology. And you might anticipate my excitement when I heard about the First Nations Center for Excellence in Epidemiology. It's like, what? Where? But so it was essentially, you can see the communities served by this collaboration. So it's a partnership. They've now renamed their partnership Mamo Ayamawin, which means everyone's voices. And I often say I can't think of a more beautiful way of expressing what epidemiology is than to call it everyone's voices. Because really it's about that collective experience that people have that can be represented by data that can help us to determine our next steps. So this collaborative came together. They actually came together to try and see how they might, harmonize their EMRs or something like that, something that would enable them to use their power as a collective rather than as individual communities, that they might be able to use data together. And they quickly got very bogged down in technical things about, systems talking to one another and whether it's possible, and some of them were on paper and some of them were implementing one EMR, some were implementing another EMR, and it was quite, it was really bogged down. So what they decided to do was collectively come together and say, what is our main priority that we want to know about? And let's use ICES data that's already sitting there to answer that question. So the question they asked was about mortality. And they said, what is our collective experience around mortality? And when they did this, there were so many amazing conversations that you might not anticipate. They were talking about the importance of honoring their ancestors whose data they were using. So they were all people who had passed. Obviously, it was a project about mortality. So there was a lot of attention paid to sort of making sure they were honoring community members who had passed and thanking them for being able to use their data to find a better path forward and finding that path towards health. So we've worked on this for a couple of years now, and the really amazing thing has happened in the knowledge sharing. So there's the collective, there's 9, actually 10 now actual organizations within, and there's over 50 First Nation communities that each signed on. So rather than saying, okay, all 133 First Nations in Ontario are just automatically going to be in the study, or all 70 that are served by this, this partnership, they went to every community and asked. And about 50 of them said they want to be part of this project. And so every single one of those communities is getting their own report too. So this project turned out to be massive. What started as sort of a simple request turned out to be quite complex because every community is getting their own report. And we've been visiting communities to talk about what the data mean, what next steps they want to take. And it's turned into, well, if you know someone who wants a whole program of research, there's one sitting here. It's a lot. There's a lot that the communities need. So I just want to begin to wrap up. So to think about the fact that Indigenous people are in many data sets that you're using, Indigenous people are there. So when you're thinking about how to tell those stories, you have to think about whether you're inadvertently or on purpose telling Indigenous community stories. Because if you are, it should be Indigenous communities telling Indigenous community stories. So if there's a high percentage of First Nations, Inuit, and or Métis in your data sets, you have to involve, build relationships, collaborate, learn, be humble, take direction, and respond. So that the importance of adequate, appropriate engagement about the use of those data for policy making, for research, for decision making. If there's actual indigenous identifiers, then don't use them until you're directed by Indigenous communities to use them. I think one of the key messages around this sort of being humble, taking direction, responding is it's a positionality thing. It's the idea of being a helper versus this idea, I just really want to help. That's the I just really want to help them idea comes from that same 5 Ds of, you know, they just can't help themselves, so I really want to help them. Rather than I want to be a helper in this process of self-determination, self-governance, of using data for governance. And the analogy that I will give is if you want to be a helper, you're helping to move the rocks out of the path for a river to flow versus like building a canal and trying to make it go the way you think it should go. So really trying to see where people are at and finding ways to help. Oh, just talk about the water. I don't need to talk about it again. So if we think about these key messages, Indigenous-centered approaches to Indigenous data and research are critical. Don't try and do it by yourself without Indigenous people. And because then you wouldn't be honoring the rights, strengths, and resilience of Indigenous nations. And my advice is to consider yourselves, if you're aiming to be an ally, to consider yourself a humble helper in the collective journey to healing and self-determination, rather than as a leader or as a savior or something like that. Really just thinking about that humility and the helping. Thank you, Yahweh.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, for that enlightening presentation. I'm sure I can speak for many of us here saying that we learned a lot, and we want to thank you for sharing your stories, your experiences, and knowledge. So at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Bernice Downey, who is our discussant today. Dr. Downey is an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies and in nursing.
My grocery list.
Okay, so I want to start out, first of all, by saying Ani Buju, Bernice Downey, Niganakwe, Dijinnikos, Mino Kishigat. Hello, greetings. My name is Bernice Downey. I've also been given the name of Niganakwe, which is head woman. It's a beautiful day. I'm Anishinaabe Kwe of both Ojibwe Soto and Celtic descent, a Nimama, or mother, and a Nokomis, or grandmother. My ancestral roots stem from Lake St. Martin, Manitoba. My community lived experience is an urban one from here in Hamilton for the most part. So I celebrate those words, and in the spirit of data sovereignty, I see me speaking in the language with the limited expertise that I have as a concept of linguistic justice. And I first heard that term, my colleague Chelsea Gable and I were up at the Universities Canada 5th post-TRC universities meeting. And there was a speaker there from the US talking about linguistic justice. And it really spoke to me, no pun intended, in this spirit of reclaiming, the loss of language. And my story is that my mother chose not to teach us our language. She feared discrimination. And that's not an uncommon story among Indigenous people. But as we look at concepts of data sovereignty and reclaiming many aspects of our culture and our heritage, language is key. And so that's my next bucket list item, is to become fluent in my mother's language. And thank you for bearing with me through that. It's kind of like learning the pronouns, avoidance of the pronouns. When you're trying to teach an old dog new tricks, right? So I would like to say Chi-miigwech, thank you to the Labelle lecture organizers, Center for Health Economics and Policy Analysis, and the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics for the opportunity to participate today. I would also like to uphold the memory of Roberta Labelle as one of the founding members of CHEPA and her research in health economics. I was really struck by the poignant situation and naming this after her. So thank you, Emmanuel, for reaching out to the Indigenous community here to welcome our colleague. As a health services researcher myself, I understand the importance of looking at why we do the things in health. After many years as a clinical practitioner and a health systems administrator, I returned to the academy for a deeper dive into the world of knowledge translation, more specifically health literacy. And this came after many years of working clinical practice as a registered nurse in mental health, working in community development for Indigenous women, putting together a violence against women, a lodge for our Indigenous women in Ottawa, and then working at administrative level. And in my area of health policy and research, I felt that we were really missing the boat in terms of how we were providing health messaging for our people. And that led me to understanding that the concepts that we needed to celebrate and reclaim, many of them are in the language. So after many years then as a clinical practitioner and a health systems administrator, and I often say at the tender age of 50, I returned to the academy for a deeper dive into the world of knowledge translation. I discovered that we needed to amplify the need to harmonize health services and health information to provide a more culturally relevant healthcare experience for Indigenous patients. Now, interestingly, but an unfortunate reality that we are trying to fix, because actually I'm not in Indigenous Studies program, I'm the Indigenous Health Lead for the Faculty of Health Science. And so I have to celebrate that because at McMaster at least we have a concentration of our Indigenous talent in social science. But I was actually the first full-time appointed assistant professor in the Faculty of Health Science. We now have 3, and we have a total of 12 cross-campus and several adjuncts. So we've got a long way to go. But the unfortunate reality for me, because I thought it would be easiest to return to health science, although I was cautious about it, but there were no Indigenous faculty to supervise me in this work. And so I had the good fortune, actually, to go into a medical anthropology program in social science, and it really was the best choice to do this work. It gave me the opportunity to marry both the health science background and be able to explore concepts of Indigenous knowledge in the language and the concepts of health and well-being, and look at how we exchange knowledge. So I am honored to support my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walker, as the 28th Labelle Lecturer, and commend her for her work and her words today. It's important that we uphold our Indigenous scholars in the Academy, and more important, that we create spaces for them to trade their knowledge. And I learned about this concept of trading knowledge yesterday at a meeting of the Well Living House, which is an Indigenous research center within the St. Michael's Hospital, led by Dr. Janet Smiley, a senior Métis researcher in family health, maternal and child health. And they were engaged in developing, renewing a memorandum of understanding with St. Michael's Hospital, which is now Unity Hospitals. And she asked me to come out and facilitate. I had been part of creating the first MOU 7 years ago. And they are now in a place where the rubber is hitting the road. So they've moved beyond handshakes and introductions and are now talking about self-determination in research. And so one of the Council of Grandparents members, because they have a dual accountability and governance arrangement, so one of the grandparents talked about this notion of trading knowledge. And it really struck home with me, because we spend a lot of time situating our Indigenous ways of knowing and making a case for them to the mainstream research world. But understanding it as trading knowledge, for me, situates and upholds our own data as rigorous and scientific in and of itself. We don't have to make a case for it. It's ours. We own it. And we've been talking about data governance as part of our worldview for a millennia. So there is a long history of exclusion of our knowledge systems within the Academy, and a rejection that's included here, an actual rejection of our application to attend the Academy, and actually results in a rejection of our ways of being, our languages, our philosophies, and our sciences. So here at McMaster, there have been examples. Gertrude Montour, a Haudenosaunee woman from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, applied to the School of Nursing and was turned down. She was also turned down in all the other schools of nursing across Canada. And I learned about this a month after I was appointed as the Indigenous Health Lead in the faculty, and I thought, oh my gosh, like we need to talk about this as a truth. So we did. We celebrated her. She's actually the great-grandmother of one of our senior Indigenous scholars here, Rick Montour. And so what she did was she went to the U.S. and she got her nursing degree. And then she joined the Canadian Army and fought for her country. And so the dichotomy in that, right, the irony. We also, we had many other stories like that, but we celebrated her that day, and it is my intention to have a speaker series that's ongoing called the Gertrude Montour Speaker Series. Lloyd King, so he was the father of our most recent scientific director of the Institute of Aboriginal Health. And he was a scholar who was the first Indigenous scholar in Canada who was able to go to university without losing their Indian status. Because that was a mechanism, again, of assimilation, that if you tried to attain higher learning and go to university, you would lose your status, and therefore your membership with your First Nations community. So once that was removed, he was the first person to graduate with that distinct recognition, and it was here at McMaster. And so as I said, there's many examples, but there are also more contemporary examples of discriminatory behavior towards Indigenous people within the Academy. We have created a pathway for our youth to get to higher learning, because that's been the focus for a long time. But the path towards addressing discrimination, racism, and other systemic barriers still stretches out into the future. So I'll focus now, however, more specifically on the topic of Indigenous research. But the two, of course, are closely related, including the barriers. So I find this period that we are in now, a post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission era, a time of reclamation and renewal. Reclamation I situate as referring to our intrinsic ways of knowing and being, and renewal of our ways of being. So I've been privy to, in my career, the dialogue of many Indigenous scientists and philosophers who have amplified the voices of our ancestors and our wisdom keepers and articulated Indigenous notions of how we engage with the world around us. From our creation stories, I have breakfast with a local Six Nations elder that are the most amazing opportunities for me. I feel very grateful. And we spent a long time one morning talking about creation stories as research of Indigenous peoples, situating, framing creation stories as research methods. Because watching and observing the world around us and understanding how we were all connected with the world around us is very much the skills. It's an Indigenous research methodology. So from our creation stories, which lay down a foundation for our indigeneity, to their expressions of the intersection between the Western research world and our Indigenous one. So thinking here of Willie Ermine's Ethical Space and Albert Marshall's Two-Eyed Seeing. I was very grateful for those scholars to have that information to guide me in my work. So it's not only these shoulders that our younger Indigenous scholars stand on, and I have the unique experience of being an early career academic, which I love, because everywhere else in my life I feel like I'm getting on that side of the fence. But it's not only these shoulders that our younger Indigenous scholars stand on, but they are expressing a renewal of Indigenous research methodologies. So we have Kovach's storytelling, we have Bort Bearskin's Indigenous nursing framework, and our own Chelsea Gable's photo voice methods, and many more. The work ahead then lies in the area of co-creating systemic change. And so this is what my colleague was really, a lot of her work is referring to. I use the term co-create because there is a need to harmonize existing research structural elements, such as policies, funding models, and other elements of the research enterprise. This work in Canada, as Jennifer talked about, through the work of OCAP, has been emerging over the last 20 plus years. And we also now, inspired by iconic Indigenous research philosophers such as Linda Smith, we now have our very own chapter in the TCPS2, for example. We can no longer engage in research with First Nations communities in the way that we used to. Helicopter methods that left us wondering less and less about the benefits of mainstream research to our well-being or way of life. And Jennifer touched on that a little bit. And yesterday again at the Grandparents Council meeting, the notion of bridging the gap came up. And Madeline Dion Stout is the grandparent. And you're lucky if you get to sit down and hear Madeline talk. She's a great philosopher. But she calls it the gasp, the bridge to the gasp. And she said that, community is not really interested in understanding how we measure up to mainstream and, that we are impoverished and all those social determinants of health. But she expressed it in this notion of the gasp, in the sense of people are appalled by what's happening in their communities. They are troubled. They are grieving. It's much more than just bridging the gap. So this work then, within the academy, we also have structural enhancements that we need to continue. And this began first, of course, with the fostering and recruitment of Indigenous research talent. Here at McMaster, we now have 12 full-time Indigenous scholars engaged in research across social science, health science, and humanities, for example. But we do need more in other faculties and programs. We are also seeing the emergence of actual physical research entities, such as our own McMaster Indigenous Research Institute, or MIRI. And this process is slow. We have, I think it's like more than 70 research centers here at McMaster, or institutes or centers. And our own institute has been having trouble getting off the ground. But we have to see it in the context for what it is. We have limited talent. They're being recruited and given very high profile positions, often, junior scholars. They're also too few to go around. And so development of our infrastructure has to be seen in the context, our lived realities. We are working closely with communities. Those processes of engagement are very different, as Jennifer was sharing. So our presence here, though, is an important signal about how we are slowly addressing our need to both uphold our ways of knowing and engage in the development of research reform that fosters the expression of our indigeneity, our unique perspectives regarding how we observe the world around us and the world where we have come. So as we move forward within this new Indigenous research paradigm, we're situated to address the mechanics of this work. This needs to be done as part of the going within approach, as I call it. For example, the creation of Indigenous research frameworks and methods are being articulated by folks like Sean Wilson, and here at McMaster by our colleagues Montour, Debicki, Marikel, and others engaged in the development of a two-row research framework. And you can be assured they're going to be talking about data sovereignty. Indigenous research frameworks will be drawn from Indigenous ethical guidelines, a reclaiming of our ancestral knowledge, protocols, and practices, and situating Indigenous research priorities, methods, and evaluation from our own spaces. So this will be guided, as Jennifer mentioned, by principles and values in the TRC and UNDRIP, principles of self-determination, experiential learning, and collective thinking. So here at McMaster, we're looking forward to the engagement both amongst ourselves as Indigenous scholars to bring this work to the fore, but also to engaging with our non-Indigenous scholars, many of whom are working with First Nations communities and need to be informed as well. Finally, we need to prepare for the future. We need to foster the mentoring and grooming of the next generation of scholars, or as we say, the faces yet to come. Here at McMaster, we have led the development and hosting of an Indigenous undergraduate summer research scholars program, a few folks who are in the room. And the reason why we did this was we wanted to foster and mentor undergraduate learners to get them to consider going to graduate school and to becoming Indigenous scholars and researchers. But we have many challenges along the way. Funding is always a challenge, right? Competition between funding, for example. But to me, it's a no-brainer to think, and we had participation across the campus from many different supervisors and programs to support these students, remove the barriers to get them to think about grad school. Now we're just doing an analysis of the first 5 years of that program. We don't have funding for this year. We're looking around, beating the bushes to see what we can do. So I'll move now to acknowledging just a couple of points, Jennifer, and I was asked to prepare a few questions. And I think for, among Indigenous scholars, we have, I think it's the good fortune of we all kind of run in the same circles. And so it was a little bit challenging to think about questions that, my goal was not to stump her, but that would be, academic enough and reflect her talk. So I think I'm going to go to my second question because I think you pretty much answered the first one. So this question then, why do non-Indigenous academics need to learn about the nuance of Indigenous research methods? Why is that important? Is it really necessary? Or should we just stay focused among ourselves and, continue to work on this knowledge? Many of us in our dissertations spend 2/3 of the time, rationalizing and validating our work with European settler thought processes so that it will be considered valid. So why do that? Why do we extend ourselves into that work? So perhaps from your position as Indigenous lead with ICES, or reflections from diving into the OCAP area with communities, that would be one question. So should I say the second question? Okay, so the second one then is, did you get that one? Do you want me to repeat it? I'll repeat it.
That's fine, it's fine.
Yeah, why do we need to educate non-Indigenous research? So the second question then is, the emergence of Indigenous research methodologies may be our way forward to uphold our priorities with respect to health and well-being. But in this environment of partisan governments, now we have a minority federal government, that establish austerity policy, why should we bother? So for instance, I want to make mention, if I may, in collaborating on a project with Chelsea. And, in trying to articulate our methods of her work, we ran against government resistance to what she was proposing as methods. This was the great SWOT analysis debate. And so, in trying to action our own Indigenous research methods, we were more or less forced to do that. And so we did it. We made it work. But we managed to massage it and put our own Indigenous research lens on it. And it actually was a fabulous project that Chelsea and her colleague led. So if you could comment then, maybe a little bit on the challenges of that and why bother?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for those. And I Bernice always says that she's like a new investigator, and I just look at her, I look to her for mentorship, so thank you so much. So your two questions, I think, are actually a little bit interrelated, but why is it important for non-Indigenous academics to learn? I think there was actually two parts, like why is it important for people to learn, and why do we need to position our work in relation to Western thought and things like that. So part of the conversation that you brought forward about the capacity we currently have to do all the work that needs to happen. So if in my work at ICES, if I did not have non-Indigenous scientists and colleagues to draw on, then the work couldn't actually be done adequately at this point. So the investments of time and heart energy that they make into challenging their own understandings of Canada and their own understandings of what they learned in medical school, if it weren't for that commitment that they have made to building their own cultural safety and their ways of thinking about Indigenous research and collaboration, then we would never be able to keep up with what communities need. So I think but what's important about that is that people do see it as a humble and generous exercise, and not as a way of building their own career. So when you find those allies and those colleagues, when I find those allies and colleagues, I'm so grateful, because I think that if people commit to doing that work, then it enhances our capacity overall. Then we don't just have one scientist at ICES or two or three, actually we have 2 or 3 Indigenous scientists at ICES. We don't just have the 3 of us trying to mentor others and try to respond to all the communities. We have others who can help. So that's part of what I think is my answer and my own experience to that. And I think that's also part of the answer to your second question around why bother, like when there's government resistance and resistance to Indigenous research methodologies. If we don't have those allies who can speak for why those Indigenous methodologies are important, I find it very hard to make progress. So I do think that some of the work that we do to help others understand reduces that resistance that we see from when we try to do things differently. I'm sure there's other perspectives on that, but I could say that from my experience.
Yeah.
Stay up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Downey, did you have any further questions? No? Okay. So let's thank Dr. Downey first. Now I open up the floor to questions from anyone here in the audience. Yeah.
My name is Sonia. I'm a recent graduate of the Health Policy Program. Bear with me as I set up my question because I think your talk is really, really promising. My work has always been focused in global health and international communities. And so what I'm curious to get your perspective on is the lessons learned around Indigenous activism, for lack of a better word, or Indigenous populations' ability to advocate for use of their own methodologies and have them engage, or have you engaged in the data collection process and research methodologies? I actually think the Indigenous communities in Canada have been quite powerful in actually establishing these relationships. What lessons do you think that, I guess, global South populations can learn from what the Indigenous community has been able to achieve?
So I think what I'll ground that in is again the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I think what has been effective is that Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination is at the center of that sort of activism, or how you call it, but it's like, it's rights. It's not a special interest group. It's not needing to do something because somebody's noisy about it. It's actually rights. And so I think if there's something to draw on for the Global South, it's that assertion of rights, and this is part of that overall assertion. So in that global Indigenous Data Alliance, we've been working a little bit with communities in Africa. And so their conversations about Indigenous data sovereignty are different than the ones we're having here, because we're saying you can't, these are our data, we need to tell our stories with our data. And they're saying, please collect data that will enable us to tell our stories, right? And so it's collecting it with this sort of, making sure that groups are represented in data and things like that. So it's a different conversation, but when it's grounded in rights, I think that's where the strength comes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. You mentioned that partnerships can be established through building relationships and signed agreements as well. In the past, we have the relationship between the United States and Canada, for example, has been very well for decades, and there is a written agreement that has been there for 25 years. And it only took one very determined leader to destroy everything to make the relationship between the countries themselves. So is it the same? Would it take one Canadian, Donald Trump, or either on the federal or the provincial level to make all the trust building efforts go away? Or do you think that it's different? This relationship between the Canadian government and the Indigenous people is different than the relationship between Canada and the United States?
Okay, thanks for that. I bet there's other people in this room with better answers than I have. But thank you, that's a really interesting question. I'm gonna try and summarize the question I forgot to do that in the last question, for the microphone and the video recording. So could Donald Trump, I'm just kidding, no, that's not. So it's talking about the relationships and agreements and whether they can be disrupted by strong personalities, and whether they're fragile enough, essentially, so these are grounded in treaty relationships. We're talking about rights and treaty relationships. So, they can be disturbed. I mean, there's still a lot of pain from some past prime ministers, and the kind of damage that happens when you have people who are not interested in working together in partnership and things like that. But I think that as long as, this is why we have to ground ourselves in the treaties, and we have to ground ourselves in rights. And that's why we start with the treaties and UNDRIP and the history, because that's, I think, you know, that can survive changing people. That's a relationship with nations and the Crown. But when we're talking about relationships like between Chiefs of Ontario and ICES, those are the ones that sometimes depend more on personalities and personal relationships and need to be bolstered by agreements and lots of care and attention. Those are not, you know, there's no treaty between us. There's agreements. And so when you're talking about projects or policy development or kinds of data governance agreements, then those are the ones that really need to be accompanied by that careful attention to relationship. You want to say something else? Okay. I got a fist bump. Okay.
Thanks for your talk. That was great. So my question is, I would say I'm more of a small data scholar, so I, you know, much smaller data. So how do you, and so when I think about OCAP, the principles of OCAP and community engagement, right, it's often, I wouldn't say it's easier, but in some ways it is easier to apply those principles and to do the community engagement aspect. But when you're thinking of big data with lots of different communities, perhaps, how do you sort of navigate OCAP and the relationship building and the community engagement and the principles that you talk about?
Okay, so the question is about with large data sets, big data that impact or involve lots of nations, how do we address OCAP? Because OCAP talks about that sort of nation level collective need for collective consent and things like that. And so it's not easy as an independent researcher to navigate that, actually. So, you know, it relies on not just my relationship with people, but also relationships between First Nations, actually. So a lot of things have to come together to make that web. So I think that general principles are that if we're using all of Ontario data, for example, includes all those nations, then it's really important that we have resolution at the All Ontario Chiefs Conference, for example, to support that kind of project, and that we're working at that level. So we're not working, so, you know, I wouldn't work, you know, with Six Nations to do an Ontario level project, right? So that it might be, they might be involved, but you know, you have to work at the appropriate level. I guess that's the thing. But what's really important about First Nations is that the sovereignty is at the nation level. It's not at the Chiefs of Ontario level, right? So Chiefs of Ontario have to rely on, I have to in some ways trust their processes to make sure that so sometimes it doesn't go perfectly, but is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah. So
You publish a paper. I mean, how, you know, typically, again, with smaller data or working with one community, it's easier to get feedback, and, right? But when we're working with multiple communities,
yeah,
it becomes that much more powerful.
it's complex to work with multiple communities at once. Oh, you guys are inside joke here. So, but I think recant all our papers, no. But so, for example, you know, the Chiefs of Ontario, if we're working on a project that way, so for example, this diabetes report that's coming out in a couple of weeks, oh no, it's next week, no, it's the week after. Anyway, it's soon, it's in November. We also have accompanying papers in the CMAJ. So those papers all went to the health coordination unit within the Chiefs of Ontario, which involves all the PTOs in Ontario. They can take it out to their communities. Like, so there's a process. Like, you have to develop the processes that support the agreements, because you can't just have the agreements without the processes that actually operationalize what OCAP means in that context. So we figured out for us in that context, in that project, what does OCAP mean? Yeah.
Here, we have Indigenous communities, but for different reasons, we don't call them regions, we call them tribes. And I will not get into the politics of that, but like our situation and Canada's situation is quite different. We have a strong governance, our governance can do some work anyways. And so what would be like a couple of things that you would say that would, what I'm trying to say was the global implication that you see, that can also be sort of translated into a very small area-wise country in very different part of this world.
Okay, so the question is about applying some of these principles in a very different context in a different part of the world, but Bangladesh is the example. So that's a place I don't know a lot about, but I actually have 2 graduate students from Nepal who are taking some of the knowledge and understanding how these things work and doing work actually in Nepal, thinking about applying some of these principles. And then I'm learning about global health and the principles and, so, I mean, these things can come together. But I think, I don't know if I have a good answer for you, other than to say that I think that it's the relationships and the politics in each place are so complex and so distinct that I think the conversations are slightly different each place, but what's important is that acknowledgement that Indigenous people have rights to their own data and to doing research their own way. So in your case, you mentioned tribes, that those tribes, when there's data reported about them and stories told about them, that it's their voices that needs to come through, right? That it's them who should decide what's collected and what stories are told. And so I think that those principles can be common. It's just how they're implemented might be different.
So I think we'll end there. But again, let's thank Dr. Walker and Dr. Downey for the time.